Chapter 9. Pick a path. Which future is best? Imagine if 80 years ago, in 1940, you had a choice. Looking ahead through wars, upheavals, discoveries, and opportunities, you could have set the United States on track to have either a slightly higher or a slightly lower average economic growth rate. It wouldn't be by much. Per person, it would mean a growth rate of either 1.27% or 1.89%, just 0.62 percentage points difference. It would seem obvious to most people to pick the higher growth rate, making sure we would provide our children, grandchildren, and their children and grandchildren with more possibilities and opportunities. Yet many people would probably be surprised by the magnitude of this small increase in growth over time. Because growth rates compound over the years, the higher growth rate would deliver a nation of individuals who would be 2/3 richer in just 8 decades. This is the choice the rich world faces today when discussing the climate. And the choice is even starker for the world's poor. Spurred on by activists and campaigners, many global leaders are poised to pick the lower growth pathway, condemning our children and grandchildren to a worse existence and ensuring that the world's poorest are trapped in a future with fewer opportunities, less prospects, and less welfare, to the tune of $500 trillion per year. The global approach to cutting carbon dioxide has mostly failed for 3 decades. Yet the climate policies resulting from that approach are likely to cost us a fortune. By 2030, the Paris Agreement will cost $1 trillion or more per year. But this is just the start. Climate panic is likely to end up costing humanity hundreds of trillions of dollars every single year. This sounds like an extreme claim, but it is based on studies undertaken over a number of years by researchers working for the United Nations Climate Science Panel, the IPCC, and published in 2017. They examined 5 different plausible scenarios for the future called the Shared Socioeconomic Pathways, or SSPs. The pathways rely on complex modeling with a huge range of different inputs and assumptions to establish various broad, plausible futures. The researchers who created these models looked at factors ranging from geopolitics to economics, trade, migration patterns, education, and health. All of the pathways show a world in which people get richer over the coming century. That prediction is soundly based on history. We spent the last 200 years growing the average global GDP per person by 1,600%, from $1,100 to about $17,500 today. But depending on which pathway we choose, there are vast differences in how much wealthier people will be. The lowest increase takes place if we go down a pathway the researchers call regional rivalry, a rocky road. In this vision of the future, see Figure 9.1, nationalism surges in many countries. That means there is less interest in a shared response to global warming. What's more, governments focus more on domestic challenges and national security instead of working together or investing in education and technological development. As a result, economic development is sluggish and income inequality persists or worsens over time. Population growth is low in industrialized countries and high in developing ones. The environment is given a low priority globally, meaning that in some regions, environmental challenges worsen. Even in this depressing and fractious future, average GDP per person in 2100 will be 170% of today's level.
Figure 9.1. GDP per person across the world for the UN's 5 scenarios, 2005 to 2100. To the right, the GDP per person in 2100 in percentage of its 2020 value.
The second worst outcome occurs if we go down a pathway called inequality, a road divided, where the world splits into 2. Rich, well-educated countries on one side and poor, less educated countries with labor-intensive, low-tech economies on the other side. While there are large investments in health and education in the rich world, poor countries are unable to make these investments, and increasing disparities in economic opportunity and political power lead to a growing gap between them. The gap between the rich and the poor worsens within countries too, so social cohesion degrades. Conflict and unrest become increasingly common. Rich countries make investments in the environment, but poor countries do not. Even in this grim scenario, by the end of the century, average GDP per person will grow to 290% of today's level. In the middle-of-the-road scenario, social, economic, and technological trends look very similar to their historical pattern. It is a scenario not dissimilar to today, where many problems remain and many solutions are underfunded. There is slow progress in health and education and technology advances without major breakthroughs. Development and income growth proceed fairly unevenly, with some countries falling behind. Global and national institutions continue to make slow progress in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN's Global Development Agenda. Yet, as we bumble our way ahead, growth over the next 8 decades will deliver GDP per person that is 450% of today's. In a 2018 survey of prominent economists, this outcome is actually seen as the most likely outcome for the 21st century. And then there are the 2 other pathways, the 2 best scenarios leading to the highest income growth. They offer us 2 completely different, conflicting approaches to making the world better off in 2100. One is the Sustainable Development, or Green Road pathway. This is an eco scenario in which there is more global harmony and cooperation. The world focuses on reducing the environmental impact of consumer consumption and ensuring that economic growth creates a smaller footprint on the planet. Governments worldwide make big investments in education and health, along with rapid technological development. Nonetheless, many policies are designed to ensure that people use fewer resources and less energy, such as by cutting meat diets and lowering consumption. As a result, total man-made greenhouse gas emissions are lower, and the scenario sees the lowest temperature rise of all 5 pathways. This world will deliver a GDP per person that is 600% of today's level. The final pathway is called fossil fuel development, or conventional development. Down this pathway, the world's sharp focus is on growth. This is achieved through strong competitive markets and policies that foster innovation and build human capital through massive investments in health and education. The world focuses on rapid technological development. Countries exploit abundant fossil fuel resources to support resource and energy-intensive lifestyles. Greenhouse gas emissions are much higher, and this scenario sees the highest temperature rise by 2100. Nonetheless, much more is invested in adaptation, and local environmental problems like air pollution are successfully managed. Here, average GDP per person soars more than tenfold, hitting 1,040% of today's GDP per person. Both of these scenarios will see the average person on the planet in 2100 with a GDP per capita of over $100,000. That may sound fanciful to us today, but top economists give these 2 final pathways at a 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 probability, respectively. Both of these scenarios will deliver amazing welfare for the average person, but the fossil fuel pathway delivers much more. Both of these scenarios will also see extreme poverty almost eradicated by mid-century, but the fossil fuel pathway will do so sooner. Over the next 3 decades, the green scenario will see 26 million more extreme poor every year. And both of these pathways will see a dramatic decline in the inequality between nations. All of the 5 pathways expect inequality to drop, as the poorer world partly catches up with the richer world. But especially the green and the fossil fuel pathways will see a dramatic reduction in inequality between nations. By 2100, under both scenarios, inequality will be lower than it has been for the past 2 centuries. And perhaps, surprisingly, the fossil fuel scenario will be even more equal than the green scenario. The research identifying different pathways gives us a really clear way of looking at the options in front of us. These are all scenarios that the researchers deem plausible from where we are now. It's reassuring to note that none of the options is a Mad Max-type dystopian future. Even in the worst of the 5 scenarios, people end up better off than today, but we should be aiming to ensure that future generations are in the best situation possible. So with that in mind, we can dig deeper into the differences between the 5 pathways. Perhaps the most important point that is clear from these scenarios is that when governments invest more in education, health, and technology, the world becomes tremendously better off, with less poverty and reduced inequality. If nobody invests in education, health, and technology, as happens in regional rivalry, or only the world's well-off countries do, as in inequality, the world ends up worse off, more unequal, and with many more poor than in the other scenarios. If governments invest modestly in all 3 areas, as in the middle-of-the-road scenario, there are modest improvements in income, inequality, and poverty. But significant investment in education, health, and technology, as in the green and fossil fuel futures, means that the world will be a much better place by 2100, with very high incomes, virtually no extreme poverty, and little inequality between nations. In the worst scenarios, the global spread of education crumbles. In the bottom 2 scenarios, only about half of all adults will get a high school education or higher, and a quarter will be without any education by the end of the century. Illiteracy, which is at 12% today, will increase to almost 1/5 of the world. Globally, life expectancy will increase at most by a couple of years over the next 8 decades. In the 2 best scenarios, almost everyone will have a high school or university degree, illiteracy will have been almost completely eradicated, and life expectancy will reach nearly 100 years of age. The most important policy choices in these scenarios have nothing to do with climate change. We need healthy populations that are highly educated, able to develop and use advanced technology. If we can manage this vital challenge, it is likely that the end of the century will see a world somewhere between 6 and 10 times richer, much more equal, and which has long since eradicated extreme poverty. It is now obvious that policy choices matter hugely in determining what the future looks like. The wrong decision will make us poorer and less literate. The right ones will make us richer, more educated, and healthier. But which decisions will be best for us as citizens of planet Earth? If we ask most pundits today which scenario they prefer, the sustainable green scenario or the traditional fossil fuel-driven scenario, it seems fair to expect that the overwhelming majority would go with the green scenario in a heartbeat. We have become so focused on global warming that the choice seems blatantly obvious. But let's drill down into the differences between the two, because there is a huge disparity in outcomes. Going down the green pathway, the average person in the world will be 6 times as rich in 2100 compared to 2020. See figure 9.2. Average income in 2100 will be an astounding $106,000 in today's currency. That is a great achievement.
Figure 9.2. Global GDP per person, 2005 to 2100, for the green and the fossil fuel scenarios. The dashed lines show the GDP per person in dollars, but higher temperatures also mean more climate damages. The full lines show the GDP per person after deducting the climate damages.
Remember, being better off correlates to better health outcomes and greater life satisfaction. More prosperity means more overall welfare, a general improvement in well-being and satisfaction. So we can reasonably say that overall global welfare is 6 times higher in 2100 under the green pathway. That's a great scenario. But down the fossil fuel pathway, the average person will be 10.4 times as rich. That is a lot better. On average, each person would earn $182,000 per year. This is $76,000 more per person per year in 2100. This is much better than the green scenario. A 10 times increase in welfare is an astonishing success. Of course, it's very reasonable to worry that the fossil fuel pathway will actually increase human misery once we take global warming into account. Using the damage estimates that William Nordhaus found based on the work by the United Nations as we discussed in Chapter 5, we can identify the climate impact on global welfare. The scenarios tell us how much warmer it will be. The green pathway takes us to a moderate temperature of 5.8 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. and the fossil fuel pathway leads us to a much warmer rise of 8.7 degrees Fahrenheit. These levels of temperature rise will mean that the actual prosperity in the green scenario will be slightly lower, 2.5%, by the end of the century, as seen in the figure 9.2. Put into financial terms, the climate damage per person per year will be about $3,000. Yet the remaining prosperity or welfare per person in 2100 will still be worth a fantastic $103,000 per person. The temperature rise will be greater in the fossil fuel scenario, and hence the damage will be bigger too, at 5.7% at the end of the century, adding up to about $11,000 per person per year. Deducting this cost from the expected GDP per person means a welfare of $172,000 per person per year in 2100. This is important and bears repeating. A straight comparison of GDP per person in dollars shows a difference between the two scenarios at the end of the century of $76,000. But climate change will cause net problems in both scenarios that reduce our prosperity or welfare. In the fossil fuel scenario, global warming will cause problems worth $11,000 per person per year, whereas in the cooler green scenario, the costs will be much smaller at $3,000. So the difference in welfare after we've deducted the climate damages is now at a slightly smaller $69,000 per person, which is the difference between $103,000 per person in the green pathway and the $172,000 in the fossil fuel pathway. Even after taking into account the climate damage, the extra welfare benefit of the fossil fuel pathway is still remarkably large. Look at it another way. If we follow the fossil fuel pathway, the average welfare in 2076, after we've deducted the climate damage, will be $79,800 for every person in the world. Under the green scenario, we won't reach that welfare before 2100. Choosing the latter means we're literally holding the world back by a generation. By the end of the century, the difference for the entire world population is a staggering $509 trillion per year. This is the choice we are faced with. Just like the hypothetical choice in 1940 between two pathways, we have to ask, why would we choose a poorer world with fewer opportunities for our children and grandchildren? What I'm arguing here, that we should pick the higher growth pathway, runs counter to the arguments of many climate change campaigners, and is especially at odds with the views of a vocal minority who believe that growth needs to be stopped altogether for the sake of the planet. In late 2018, nearly 240 academics signed a letter declaring that economic growth is bad for the planet. They reject sustainable and inclusive growth as insufficient concepts and argue that instead, indicators of resource use and inequality should be given a higher priority than GDP in political decision-making, that income should be capped, and that working time should be reduced. They and global supporters of the no-growth economy have held conferences in Mexico City, Mexico, Malmö, Sweden, and Brussels, Belgium. This is a movement that says more about the self-indulgence of rich country academics than anything else, but it is worth emphasizing how dangerous the concept is. Obviously, the supporters of no growth would argue that they do not merely want to stop economic growth, but want to encourage more education, health, and technology, especially for the world's poorest. But in a realistic world, less or no growth means that distributional fights become more vicious, and it seems naive to expect that ever-increasing shares of a small cake would go to the least powerful. What is clear is that of the UN's different projected futures, the low-growth scenarios are utterly unattractive, most especially for the world's poor. Heeding the call of no growth would likely mean we would have much fewer resources for healthcare, education, and technology. This outcome would trap us in a world with far fewer resources to further human welfare. In this scenario, the anti-growth campaigners would have succeeded in ensuring the world is only a small amount richer by the end of the century. Our dramatic progress in eradicating poverty would be halted. The world would be a much bleaker place, less healthy, less educated, less technologically advanced. Picking a lower GDP pathway does not just mean accepting dramatically lower welfare. The harsh reality is that reducing income also literally kills people. Being richer means living a safer life. When you have a higher income, it allows you to buy more risk reduction, from safer cars to bicycle helmets to better medical care and more nutritious food. Researchers have looked at the impact of higher incomes and found that they lead to lower death rates, both because you can afford more health care and because you can afford to give your children better opportunities. All of this means that kids are more likely to survive and thrive in adulthood. Having $69,000 worth of higher welfare for every person every year can make you a lot safer. Using the estimates in the literature, it is likely that by the end of the century, the green pathway will see 3 million more deaths each year compared to the fossil fuel pathway. We stand at a forked road with different paths ahead of us. Our fear of climate change is pushing us down the sustainability pathway. This sounds like things we need. More inclusive development that respects environmental boundaries, shifting our emphasis away from economic growth and reducing our consumption. Yet the result is that humanity will be $500 trillion worse off, with more poor people, more inequality, less opportunity, and millions of more premature deaths than if we decide on the fossil fuel pathway. We will be choosing to make each person on the planet $69,000 worse off per year, even after taking the costs of climate change into account. Following the fossil fuel pathway doesn't mean that we ignore climate policy. In Section 4, we will talk about the right climate policies we should enact to ensure that we also tackle climate change. But it is more important for the bigger picture that we get all of our other policies right. Notice what the UN clearly lays out is important for avoiding the bad scenario outcomes. It has almost nothing to do with climate. It's all about investing massively in education, health, and technology, especially for the world's poorest. Our preoccupation with climate change makes us forget these simple truths. Choosing the right pathway will result in huge benefits from free trade, harnessing innovation and ingenuity, strong developments in human and social capital, and technological improvements, as well as more access to energy. If we choose the right pathway, we will leave our children and great-grandchildren with far greater opportunities. The benefits will especially help the world's poorest, as we will see in the next chapter.